but I'll do my very best. So before I introduce the both of them, I would just like to say a very big thank you to Dakota Dreams, who is hosting us in their beautiful space today. So Vienna, who's one of the co-founders of Dakota Dreams, is with us today. Vienna, can you give a wave? Can everyone please give her a round of applause? She's been always so kind and helpful and helping us to set up and basically just really being very accommodating for everything. And please support them. So a little background about Dakota Dreams. So they were actually set up by a group of five retirees. And it's actually a second-hand bookstore. So if after the talk, you can wander around and take a look. So they sell like children's books, comics. There's also Singlit. So feel free to grab one or two books along the way out. So so this is welcome to Ethos Dreams. And today we're having a conversation on ways to love Singapore. Okay, so very big topic, very big topic, and depending on who you ask, you have very, very different answers. So we have two very special speakers with us today, and Constance Singam is one of them. So she's a writer and civil society activist, and she has led women's organizations and co-founded civil society groups, been a columnist in national publications, and co-edited several books. And her non-fiction works include Representing Women and The Art of Advocacy in Singapore.
Where I was.
She has written two memoirs, including Where I Was.
Yes.
And Never Leave Home Without Your Chili Sauce. She has also written 3 children's books. So I think not many people know this, but one of her children's books is called Porter the Adventurous Otter. And she was inducted into the Singapore Women's Hall of Fame in 2015. Next we have Alfian. So Alfian Sa'at is the resident playwright with theatre company Wall Rice. His published works include 3 collections of poetry. Okay, we don't have all of them here, but we have A History of Amnesia. There's also One Fierce Hour and The Invisible Manuscript. 2 collections of short stories, both of which we do have, which is A Corridor and Malay Sketches. And 3 collections of plays, and 2 published plays, Cooling Off Day, and most recently, The Wonderful Hotel. I hope that most of you have had a chance to catch it because it's so wonderful. It's a 5-hour play, but totally worth it. He's also the co-editor of non-fiction essay anthology Raffles Renounced, Towards a Merdeka History. So without further ado, I'll give the conversation over to Alfian and Constance.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. If I had a choice, I would stay at home in an air-conditioned room. But that you made an effort is really, really fantastic. It's amazing you're interested in Singapore and what it is all about. And I have been a Singaporean all my life, I was able to vote when Singapore became independent. So that's how old I am. And when I was asked, Ethos asked me who I would like to have conversation with, I said Alfian. And
thank you.
These 2 minorities who have, in fact, over the many years, he's known as the Enfant Terrible. And he wrote a poem which resonates for me, Singapore, You're Not My Country. And of course, people think just because you write poems like that, protesting, resisting, you don't love your country. And because of who I am and my civil society activism, the same thing people talk about, think that we are anti-Singaporean. We are what we do because we are Singaporean. We are what we do because we want to aim for that dream that we had, the vision of Singapore we had, at least I had, when we first became independent. So, yes, there is much to love. And Alfian,
Yes.
You're not my country. Why did you write that? And and I would like to. Those were the days when we were very angry. Now we are much older. I am much older, and Alfian has also grown up. So so he
older,
can much older, and we can now talk about what is it about Singapore that we love. What is it about Singapore that we dream of? What is the kind of Singapore that we want? This is the kind of Singapore that we want, So I'm going to hand over to Alfian.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So that's a great question. Oops, to begin. Sorry.
It might be mine.
Is it the right away? Okay. Yeah, so your question of like why I wrote that poem, right? Hello, yeah. So that poem was written when I was 19 years old, and it was very interesting that it was surfaced in Parliament after so many years. I think, many years. The book itself was published in the year
1995, was it?
very early. I think it could be 98. Yeah, in 98,
okay.
yes. And then it was surfaced in Parliament because of the Yale NUS thing. There was a course that it wasn't really even a course, it was just an experiential kind of program for 1 week. And it wasn't even an entire module. Maybe I need to be away from the mic, yeah. But it was surfaced, since 98 to 2019. 21 years, am I right? I can't math very well. So for many years, when the book was in print, whatever, it was never a problem. And then all of a sudden, when the course was cancelled, and I think people like scrambling for reasons to see, to come up with rationalizations for why it was cancelled, then that particular poem became a sticking point. So for me, it was very clear that the poem was already out there. If people had problems with it, I think they might have raised it in the past, but it was quite clear to me that people were nitpicking on it, and of course selectively quoting from it as well. So this whole issue about loving Singapore, and even if I may talk about the phrase loving critic, right? I think it's a little bit of a trap as well. I mean, as much as I really want to thank Tomiko for coming up with that phrase, for talking about critics who actually, despite their criticism, actually love Singapore. But I think there also needs to be space for people who are just critics. And I'm not saying necessarily me. There can be sarcastic critics, there can be snarky ones, there can be frustrated critics as well. But the whole idea about having this notion of a loving critic and somehow a need to kind of perform loyalty or patriotism before you can actually criticize, I think is also a little bit of a rhetorical trap. So I think there needs to be space for all kinds of critics, not just loving critics. So to go back to today's topic, right, this particular question about ways to love Singapore, I think as much as I think we might want to explore the different ways, I think it's also important to unpack what do we mean by love, and also what do we mean by Singapore, right? Who's Singapore? Which Singapore? Are we talking about Singapore? When we say Singapore, do we mean the regime or the people?
When you talk about love, when you love, I think they can hear me.
Are you sure?
Can you all hear me?
Maybe
Yes.
mic better,
I
lah.
have
Are you
a
sure?
loud voice, yes. When you talk about loving,
Yes.
I read somewhere
I think the mic will be better actually. Yeah, please.
when I know you're taking, No, when you talk about loving, it also means suffering.
Yeah.
You don't just love, you suffer. You put up with a lot of things, and we suffer. The more sensitive you are, the more dream you have, you also suffer. And so you go on with the love part.
Sure, yes. Yeah. So the question is also like, is it unconditional love, right? Is that love something that needs to be earned? Is that love also kind of love-hate as well? Because you need to go through a process where before you realize you love someone, as you mentioned, that there is that suffering that's involved there. So I think there needs to be that whole process, a certain kind of baptism of fire before I think you can really claim to love something or someone. Yeah. So and I think it's important that we all go through that process. So if I may just throw out, rather than answering ways to love Singapore, one of the things I would like to propose is a way not to love Singapore, which is this development of a certain sense of superiority in what Singapore is. This idea of Singaporean exceptionalism, and I've always had problems with that, right? Because then you are kind of very blinkered to the merits of the others around you. So I feel that we have a Singaporean nationalism that's unfortunately constructed on being superior to, let's say, our neighbors. And I'm gonna refer to that horrible video that was circulating about that Singaporean stand-up comedian who made fun about do you know about this? So there's this woman called Jocelyn Chia, right? She's based in the United States. She made a joke about, so there's a Malaysian in the audience, and then she made this whole joke about, your planes don't work, So number one, making light of the tragedy of MH370, which is really awful because I cannot imagine a Malaysian comedian making fun of, let's say, the Silk Air crash, for example, which is something that happened in Singapore. It's a national tragedy for us, yeah. And I think also she made remarks about, you didn't want us, you expelled us, you kicked us out, but now we are better than you. So she compared Singapore to that ex-partner that you rejected, and then the revenge is kind of like succeeding, yeah. And I've always had a problem with that. So the idea that our nationalism is built on spite and revenge is really problematic, and also I don't think completely historical either, because we have had this narrative of being expelled from Malaysia for so long. And this year, finally, they're going to release what is known as the Albatross Files. You've heard about this, right? Where it actually showed that there were these secret negotiations between the political elites on both sides. So Ho Jin Chai knew about it, Goh Keng Swee knew about it, Rajaratnam knew about it. And that actually it was a mutual agreement to separate. Yeah, it wasn't this unilateral, okay, Tunku is just kicking us out. But because we've lived that kind of narrative, that trauma, whatever, then the whole idea of, look at us, we're doing better than you, our exchange rate is better, or whatever, I think that's a very shallow and I think quite toxic way to build up a certain kind of pride for your country. So I don't think that pride needs to come from, okay, we are better than everyone else.
You're excusing the politicians.
Yes.
There were politicians who thought we were superior.
Of course. And I think this is a very dominant narrative, right? And I do feel that the Malaysian backlash wasn't just about MH370. I think it was a frustration by a lot of people who assume that Jocelyn Chia is merely verbalizing what is already in a lot of Singaporeans' minds, right? So there's this whole thing about edgy comedy, which is that you say aloud what you think a lot of people are already thinking. And I think this is something that, for me personally, it's easy to construct nationalism out of that, but I think it's really the lowest hanging fruit, and I think we should really aim a lot higher for that. Yeah, should come much more from a position of humility, position of compassion, position of like really appreciating, our neighborhood actually.
It's going to be hard for Singaporeans.
Why though?
Yeah. No, for me, my generation grew up as being part of Malaysia. We were part of Malaya. And, we were traveling up and down, visiting relatives and all that. So it was a difficult one for us, to be a separate island. But then also it took us a long time to recognize that Singapore itself had a history. And it's only very recently, because our history was just PAP history, and the PAP is responsible Yes, they are responsible for a lot of modernization and our wealth. But Singapore also has a very long history beyond Raffles, and which is something we are not aware of, and it has come to our attention only very recently. One of the things about Singapore is that it's a port city, and that there is a book by the National Library Board about port cities, and you will find that port cities had always been multicultural. 400-500 years or so, we've always been multicultural. And if you look at Batavia, which is now Jakarta, Kochi, these are all port cities, and they've always been multicultural. There is a tolerance of different religions. There's a tolerance of different races in these. So it's a 500-700-year history which we are not talking about or thinking about. So in that sense, our multiculturalism is different, but it's not new. And that's the best thing for me about multicultural Singapore. And what I love most about it is that I remember once when I arrived at Changi Airport. When you arrive at Changi Airport, it's so good to be home. Just like when we go into our own home, you open the door and say, oh, it's so good to be home, because it's comfortable, the aesthetics and so on, it's ours, we grew up with, and that's a feeling you get when you arrive at Changi. But there's another story to it. In the same flight were about 5 or 6 young Indian men, and they were talking behind to me as we came out to Changi. And one of them said, oh, we now can speak Tamil. In other words, they were not able to speak their language where they were coming from. And that struck me. One of the best things about Singapore is we can be who we are. We can be Singaporean, but we can also celebrate our language and our culture. You can be what you are. And that was what this was years ago, mind you, those young men were expressing, that we can be who we are. And that's one thing about Singapore that I love, the multiculturalism. I love going to Little India, and I love the fact I can go to Arab Street or Chinatown, and that multiculturalism that we celebrate. I wish more of us would celebrate. I remember when I have been away for some years and I came back home, that first year I was celebrating Hari Raya, I was celebrating Deepavali, none of which were my culture, but I was celebrating celebrating Chinese New Year. I did that for a few years, then I got a bit tired of having so many celebrations. But I love those celebrations. I love those kind of different cultural events that we can all be part of. And of course, common things about food, multicultural food and all that is also. But when I came here, I was reminded of how much I know there's a lot of, today we're only going to talk about loving Singapore. We're not going to talk about anything else. And so I was going to say about HDB, and all the problems we have about HDB estates. But where I am, and I have been living there for 25 years, just along my corridor, we have my immediate neighbor is a Muslim from Bangladesh, and they're fully covered, young children, and they can go take public transport and not feel threatened, And then there's somebody from Lucknow at the end of the corridor, and the rest of us. Then there's somebody from the Philippines. The rest of us are all Singaporeans, But the fact is that in Singapore, you can be living in such close proximity and not feel threatened. and if you think of what's happening elsewhere in the world, we can be proud of that. And then again, I love not so much Orchard Road, of course. I said I like Little India and Arab Street. I love the SDB centers, places like this, which is authentic, which is energetic. It's got energy and truly a Singaporean energy that you won't find in Orchard Road. So these are places that, and also, I think it's time you.
No, it's okay. Can continue, it's okay. It's all right. So just to pick up on what you said about language. So they were mentioning the play Hotel that I wrote, and there are 11 scenes in the play, all taking place in the same hotel room. And when we devised the play with all the different actors, we also encouraged them to also speak non-English languages. And at the end of the day, the play contains like 9 languages. And we felt that was really reflective of Singapore. So as you mentioned, a port city where people with different backgrounds, so the kind of cosmopolitanism is there. A lot of churning is going on. And one of the things I find interesting is that we have a Peranakan museum, right, in Singapore, and I think that's great because I feel that that's a kind of celebration of hybridity, just like going on and off, of hybridity and all the kinds of intermingling that has happened. And the word Peranakan in Malay also means womb. It comes from the root word anak, which is child. So anyone who is kind of like acculturated in a certain mother culture, right? So, but I do feel that in Singapore, when you say Peranakan, immediately a lot of people will just think Peranakan Chinese. But there were Jawi Peranakans, there were the Chitty Malakas, so like a lot of this interesting kind of acculturations between Indian and Malay culture, or Arab and Malay culture, for example. And I was discussing with a friend the other day, and he was pointing out that in old Malay texts, there's also the term Portuguese Peranakan, which is practically Eurasians, right? So I think there's a question like, okay, then why don't we have either Eurasian museum or like why the Eurasian community not included in a Peranakan museum, for example? I feel like there's a whole thesis though, because why is it just intra-Asian kind of like interactions and commingling and intermarriages that we're celebrating, but not, let's say, European and Asian? Okay, you want to say something?
Yeah. I want to say something. Because Peranakan, I mean, when I talked about the 500 years,
Yes.
of the mingling of Western traders and local traders and the growth of the Peranakan, all the Chinese in Singapore and Southeast Asia, particularly Penang, Southeast Asia. And it's out of that the Peranakan culture grew out, It's a mixture of Chinese, Indian, Malay. Whereas the Eurasians is a different background, different history, So they have to have their own museum. And because their history is different.
Okay.
And I remember a friend whose father is English, mother Chinese, and she went and argued went to the immigration office, the IC office, to say she wants to be called Eurasian. And because she's, sorry, not Eurasian, she was put down as Eurasian, but she said that's a different culture. So she put herself down as Anglo-Chinese, So these kind of variations, the histories are different, So you can't have people with Peranakan background will protest.
So I understand that those words have solidified and that there's certain meanings attached to it. But I guess I'm arguing for maybe a more capacious definition of what could be included in Peranakan, because I understand the colonial encounter, for example, right? And I understand the history where, let's say, you're Eurasians, and this was happening in a lot of other colonized countries, where there was a certain racial hierarchy, in which the Eurasians were considered superior to the people who were just Asiatics or Orientals or Asians, right? And in other countries, they've been known as the mestizos, and there's the mulattoes and all that, right? That's got white blood in them. That said, though, I do think this concept of the Peranakan, I think, can be expanded as one that includes people of mixed ancestry. Yeah, I guess I'm arguing for maybe a kind of redefinition of that term. Yeah. yeah, but Peranakans are free to argue with me. It's okay. I mean, we argue about like the origins of Malay food and Peranakan food, right? So, yeah. You take my food, I take your Peranakan identity. I really find it, I'm just kidding about this culture wars regarding food and
when I was launching my book, Chilli, Don't Leave Home Without Your Chili Sauce, I had two women, very well known in their communities, Malay community and Peranakan community, and helping me to launch the book. And I remember when she was talking, she was protesting. When she was talking, she was protesting. Because they were both questioning the authenticity or the origin of a particular food. So there. But it makes for very interesting conversation, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And this reminds me of how UNESCO is a source of so much conflict, because if countries like proposing their intangible heritage, cultural heritage and all that, and then you have like, nasi goreng, who does it belong to? Pate, is it Malaysian, is it Indonesian, for example, right? So that of course is a critique of the nation-state model, and basically that kind of like UN nation-state infrastructure in general, right? But I do believe at the end of the day, a lot of these things are shared, and there's so much porosity between them. I think the issue with this notion of Peranakan claiming Malay food, for example, I think is a bit complicated, because as much as I would like to believe it's shared culture, but we also know that there's a certain kind of like class angle to it. So I always joke, I say there's Peranakan and then there is premium Peranakan. So, and premium Peranakan will tell you that their kueh is superior to Malay kueh because it takes like more hours to prepare, for example. Their Peranakan nasi lemak is, so there's a class prestige kind of dimension, right? So the coconut is from single origin coconut.
What is a single origin coconut?
I mean, I feel a lot of these things like branding, right?
No, explain single origin coconut.
I feel like maybe it's taken some reference from like malt whiskey, I don't know. Maybe some person might be better, but it sounds good, no? Single origin coconut. From like special whatever plantations, with specially trained macaques to pluck it. And served on banana leaf taken from Pontianak-free banana trees or something, So I'm saying that sometimes it's a function of like class, it's a function of capital. So I think that's the stuff that I'm not so fond of. The idea that, if you're making Malay kueh, there's not enough labor that goes into it. It's very slapdash, whereas the Peranakan one is like steeped in so much connoisseurship, for example, So, it always seems so a little bit more elevated. But I do think a lot of that is branding, marketing language, and for me personally, fundamentally, it's really shared culture.
My mother, who comes from Kerala, is the first generation, I'm the second generation. coconuts that come from Kerala taste better.
Yes. I think
You
so.
know, vegetables that come from Kerala taste better because their soil is better. But we have reached a state in our nationhood or in our culture, slowly, those kind of, like what my friends were disputing about the origins, I think that will disappear. One of the reasons why I wrote that book, it's a food memoir, and the name of which is
Don't leave
Don't
home
leave.
without chili sauce.
Thank you. Don't leave
a long
home
title.
without chili sauce. And I traced 50 years journey of how we have changed in what we eat. You know, when I was a child, I only ate what my mother cooked, which was food from Kerala origin. Okay? Now we eat all kinds of food. When I first ate pasta, I thought it was too tomatoes, and I didn't like it. But now I cook pasta quite often in my home. So that way we have changed, you know. And just by looking at the food and the our eating habits, we have become better people, I think, more tolerant of each other. So that's why when a foreigner protests against cooking curry by her neighbor, 23,000 Singaporeans cooked curry that weekend, you know, and that says something about us, the kind of people we are developing. And in spite of public policies, I think my dream, what I dreamt about when we had independence celebration, about this country which can succeed as a multicultural country as nowhere else in the world, because we've had been multicultural for the longest time. And I think what has sabotaged those movements, but it will still happen, were our public policies. But I think in spite of the public policies, there are communities in Singapore which have become more multicultural. And although we accept differences more easily, we don't ignore differences. And I think we have to reach a stage when we can ignore differences. And that stage will come when we are more mature and more confident. And so to go back to the point that we are arrogant Singaporeans, that's the point. We are not mature. We are not confident about ourselves, about who we are. It's a stage we have to reach. So I think, can we open the discussion and to the floor?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thanks, Chilli. Yeah, you have to say something.
No, okay. No, thank you. No, I would really love to listen to questions from the floor as well. But I totally agree with you, Constance, that that arrogance, that kind of like posturing is also there's insecurity there, right? That we're not that confident of who we are yet, and therefore we need to project this kind of energy.
Yeah.
I was gonna say BDE, but no, just energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to talk about language also, actually, right? And I think in Singapore, so when I was talking about hybridity, one thing that people will always say when they're talking about Singapore identity is something like Singlish, for example. But I also want to say that even like within certain languages, there have been a lot of loan words that's been exchanged and imported and exported and all that, right? So I know between Malay and Hokkien, there's really quite a lot. I mean, words like tauge
Yeah.
has been imported into Malay. It's now practically a Malay word. There are words like kongsi, for example, which has undergone semantic shift. So in Hokkien, it would mean like clan, association, but in Malay, to kongsi is to share something. Yeah. And I wonder these days, actually, what are the Mandarin words that are loaned into Malay? And to be honest, I don't think there are many. And somehow or the other, I think that kind of traffic of loan words between the different languages has kind of stopped. And I think that might have to do with the fact that we have English right now as a mediating language. But I kind of miss that actually, even in Hokkien, right? So there's some Malay words like sabun, which is soap, like jamban, which is toilet, kawin, which is marry, right? But from Mandarin to Malay, I can only think of one word, and that's the word tapao. So
it's Mandarin,
it's Mandarin,
I
right?
thought it was
Tapao?
Malay.
She thought it was Malay.
I thought it was Malay.
Right? I think, is it Cantonese or Mandarin?
Cantonese.
Chinese?
Cantonese.
Is it?
Dana says Cantonese.
Is it Cantonese? It's not Mandarin? Okay. Any Mandarin speakers want to set the record? Okay, I'll just assume it was Mandarin. Yeah. Okay. Oh, I see. Right.
Oh no.
Five
Next
o'clock.
time I ask for tapao, I will remember.
Right, okay. Yeah. Okay. Because in Malay, previously you would just say bungkus, right? But then that would be for foods that are not like soupy, for example. And I find so mostly rice, But I find that as the Malay palate has changed, and maybe they're eating more noodles or soupy stuff, that you can't just wrap it in like newspaper or that brown paper, right? So then the word tapao is a bit more expansive.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
But also you have to remember that Mandarin is an imposed language. It was imposed on the Chinese population in Singapore. But their culture over the years had been the different dialects, And so, for instance, Hokkien was spoken more often in Singapore. And so you have that, some of words will come to Peranakan Malay use. And that's one of perhaps the more tragedies of the language policy was that it deprived Singapore Chinese of their dialects and their culture. And so it will take a long time before Mandarin words come into the Malay language. Kage, did you want to say something? No? Okay. Okay. Mandarin. He says Mandarin.
So I think this is a very Singaporean thing also, kind of like debating over like the origins of words and all. So I would like to also say that because the word tapao is imported to Malay, and then it's been subject to Malay grammatical rules. So in Malay there's affixation, so we like to put the word me before a certain verb. And now in Malay, you'll say menapau, for example.
Oh, we say tapao.
Yeah, but if you want to be grammatically correct, so it shows that it's been assimilated into the grammar of the language. But you mentioned something which I thought was really interesting, right? Where early on you talked about multiculturalism and we're talking about language. But I think in Singapore, we also have this official policy of multiracialism. And I find in Singapore, that word I think is very specific. We don't say multiculturalism, we say multiracialism. And I think it is a reference to the idea of the four main races, right?
So
what are your thoughts on this? Do you think, because on one hand, the Peranakan Museum celebrating hybridity, which is basically the interstices between all these so-called official races. And then on the other hand, for administration and governmentality kind of purposes, we've retained the CMIO model. Your thoughts, Constance?
It's a lack of imagination, I think. But multiracialism is an easier division to manage. Now, if you say multi-ethnicity, the headache of recognizing all ethnicities, how do you do that? I mean, in England and France, for instance, you have a lot of mixes, multiculturalism, but they already had an established culture and language. We never did, We are a new nation. And I'm not sure what the point of this talk I am going. Tell me, what was your question?
So your thoughts on CMIO?
Yeah, as I was saying, it is an easy way to divide and rule. And I can tell you, it's not easy governing a multiracial country. All the trouble. So you do have to give them some credit for having managed so peacefully about living and accepting each other. I know as activists, we always think of the negative part of policies, and in fact, I have been writing essays on civil society activism and so on. So I have been focused on what policies have done to us, So it took me a while, the last few days, to rewind my brain and think of what is wonderful about Singapore. So we had to forget about the politicians and the politics of it. We had to think of Singaporean, the people, and the country. And that's something we have had difficulty dealing with because we had one-party system and they right from the beginning had equated the party with the country. If you're anti-PAP, you're anti-Singapore. And that's something we have to avoid. So I had to then rethink about why am I here? Why am I living here? Because I love this country for its multiculturalism, for the way I can celebrate the various cultures, for its history, for the location of Singapore in Southeast Asia. I love that, that we are in the midst of many cultures and in the midst of many histories, and that we are part of that history.
So before we open it up, maybe I have one question for you. So reading your book Where I Was, and I highly encourage you to pick up a copy. such a wonderful, satisfying read. I think it gives so much insights, especially into the work of activists who went through things like the Marxist conspiracy and all that. And she does mention the kind of climate of fear that gripped many members of civil society and how that was overcome. But in your book, you do mention that a lot of your siblings are overseas, right? And I suppose my question is, what makes you stay, Constance? So many of your siblings, I mean, your family is so globally mobile, but what is it that makes you stay in Singapore? Yeah.
I didn't have any children to worry about.
Right, okay.
That is a major point of decision making for families. And my sisters decided anyway, they went to university in Australia, and they got married there, and they settled there. And I can say that as minority Indians, they are doing much better socially and career-wise than they would have done here. And my sisters went in the 1970s when the language policy became. And I remember my sisters, they were teachers, saying that they go into the staff room and people were talking Mandarin, and they felt alienated and marginalized. And my answer to your question is, this is my country, I'm going to fight for it.
Right.
I can, and because I don't have commitment, I can do that. I'm not going to give it up to the Chinese. Sorry. I have been here all my life, and I want to be part of this process of having respect for each other, recognizing each other, and the beauty of multicultural society.
Yep.
And I thought I have to fight for it. So I was involved in feminism and in a women's organization, but everything we do, whether we were part of feminist movement, we were part of the general civil society, getting people together, part of the movement towards better human rights for foreign workers. Everything was leading to a value system. So I'm not just a feminist. What I am doing is to make Singapore a better place.
Yes.
To work towards a value system when we can be. Sorry, I am sitting here and sermonizing.
It's okay.
I think you've earned that right. And what you say actually reminds me of a quote by James Baldwin. And this is in a letter that he wrote to a friend where he says, "The place in which I'll fit will not exist until I make it."
Yeah.
And I think that's what you've decided to do, right? To stay on and fight. That said though, all these challenges that you face over the years, and I think you detail some of them in your book, people who are like warning you, people saying, be careful, don't be too vocal, people are watching, etc. I mean, how do you overcome many of these challenges over the years?
We are moving away from the topic, aren't we?
But that's a lot.
It was difficult. It was difficult. No. You wake up in the morning and you wonder if the police is not going to come and knock on your door. You don't go to sleep thinking that police will come and knock on your door at 2 o'clock in the morning. So those were fears, but there are other people who have really had to suffer the ISA, I didn't have to. But you live day by day.
Okay.
Because you believe in what you do. You have a responsibility, you have a commitment to your organization. And that keeps you going. Then, of course, I began to get old, and they said they don't bother old ladies. So then I became, I haven't had many opportunities to be braver than I was when I was young. Because now I'm not very involved with just writing books and publishing books. So, but the only way, like living in old age, when you live day by day, when you are activist, you live day by day and do what you have to do. And I did fear the use of ISA. For the longest time, I did fear the use of ISA. When we say something, when we do something, is the ISA going to be used? Fortunately, it has not been used since 1987, wasn't it?
For the terrorists, right? The terrorist related
Marxist
ones.
conspiracy.
But they've used ISA for terrorism related activities.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. Terrorism related, there was the use of ISA when we had worries about terrorism, And so even now, I think civil society is far more active, young people are more active, mainly because they're more educated, they're more confident, they're more articulate, when we were doing it, we were pioneers in that, you know. So we lived in fear for a long time.
Yeah.
Also, people who are very active now don't fear this generation, gig generation. So they don't worry too much about long-term career security that we did, you know. One advantage that I had, and therefore, as a result, I was president many times, was I was single. You know, I didn't have to worry about job security. I had financial resources. I was financially secure. So all those elements in my life, the security in my life, allowed me to be who I am or who I was. And that not many people are lucky. I had the language, I could be articulate, and so not many people are. If you look at the history of AWARE and its presidents, you notice a pattern there.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Constance.
And I love what you said about as you grow older, you care less about these things. And I really admire the fact that you're still raising hell at your age. The fact that the book launch for where I was supposed to be at the Arts House, right? And then they cancelled the venue at the last moment. I think when I grow up, I want to be just like you. to be deplatformed, in your 80s is an achievement, I feel. It means you are still doing something right. Because
Hey, it wasn't me, okay? It was the scary cats in the civil service who did that, you know? So,
but your book was
I mean, that book was launched at the Arts House 10 years before that.
Yes, exactly.
So what you have to worry about is that the civil service still has people. So 10 years before that, the book was launched, what I said, was launched at Arts House, but 10 years later, they were too scared to use the Arts House. What is happening in civil society is something that we have to discuss. You know, what is happening? Why did that happen? And so the culture is getting worse. Our education system is not empowering people. It's something that we haven't started talking about. You know, why is something, and then I do end up with positive remarks every time. I said I love Singapore very much.
Yes.
I did. I admire what we have achieved. You know, I don't like capitalism very much, which is why I was a flag-waving Singaporean when Singapore became independent, was because we were a socialist democracy. And we were multicultural. Those were the three things that were promised to us, which is what I am still sad about. And if I talk about it, I will cry. Okay? All right, hold on.
Thank you. So I want to just share, I think my own coping mechanism when it comes to all these challenges is to always maintain a sense of humor, I feel. So I remember like when there was the AWARE EGM in 2009, and then Teo Soon Min went up in front of the crowd and said, "I'm a feminist mentor." And then she held up a book and she said, "I'm on page 73, right?"
I put her there, you know.
Seems
I
like
am the only one who knew her history.
right. I see.
That's the irony of it.
So we're tracing it back to you. So Constance, she put the Kusuma's name inside that book. So I came up with this game, which is called the I'm on page 73 game, where you open up any book, go to page 73, and replace a word with the name Teo Soon Min. And we had so much fun on Facebook with that. It was hilarious. And I remember when my Yale and US thing also got cancelled. Of course, I was
upset, and then all the attacks were coming in, that I was trying to like teach or groom students to become dissidents or something like that, right? And I remember it was quite a dark period for me personally, but when I looked back and I was looking at the Facebook post that I made, apparently one of my responses was to counter-propose a program. So the program is supposed to be called Dissent and Resistance, and then my counter-proposal was, I can't remember what it was, like dialogue and compliance or something like that. And then there was stuff like, okay, one of the events was Democracy Classroom by Kirsten Han. And then my counter-proposal was, okay, change Democracy Classroom into detention class. Then there's a sign making workshop, and then change it to a line writing workshop. Write 1,000 lines, self-criticizing, to criticize yourself. I will not, blah, blah, blah. So I think because of my own position in the arts and all that, I mean, a lot of things I actually find quite funny at the end of the day, and that's one way I think being able to survive in Singapore. You really have to look at the absurdity of things, right? Things like civil servant paranoia, like the stuff that you're so scared about. It's really quite surreal, quite absurd, and you can't help but just laugh at it at the end of the day.
Well, Alfian brought up the 2009 Aware saga. When Aware was taken away, and that's something that is so wonderful about Singapore, is that we take a lot of pride in our secular society. And Aware won it back because a lot of Singaporeans who were not Aware members, but who became Aware members on the spot to vote for the old guard of Aware to get Aware back. So that speaks also something about who we are and what we love about. I think we have to stop talking so we'll allow people to talk.
Yes.
Okay, yeah? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
Shall we open up for questions?
Yeah. So opening up the floor for questions. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
Oh my goodness, we talked too long.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Alfian or Constance?
No.
Oh, we have someone who wants to ask a question.
Hi, sorry, my name is Arun, and earlier you all were talking about the porosity of culture, of language, and of food, right? And Constance was saying that correct me if I'm wrong, but you said you're feeling that it's getting better. So I guess my experience hasn't been that. I think when left by itself, the porosity I think is a lot more with. But when you add in administrative things like the CMIO, I feel like what has happened now is porosity, but like essentialized porosity, right? So an example would be when you consider food. I remember I was on a Grab recently, and the driver was a Chinese guy, and he was like, "Oh, you had lunch already? No, you haven't had. No, I love biryani. Are you gonna have nasi biryani?" And I was like, Indians don't actually have nasi biryani very frequently. It's usually it's like a celebratory thing, like a event of morning. It's like, no, how can you not be Indian? We don't eat nasi biryani. Like, it's nothing against him, right? But to me, what I sort of felt like was like, we do know stuff about each other's culture, but I feel like it has been summarized to the point of there's a significant loss of nuance. So I guess I wonder, when we are exchanging things on Racial Harmony Day or whatever other sort of events, are we actually transmitting the nuance as well? Are we giving like a very massaged version of it? And what then happens if this continues generation to generation?
Yeah.
It's a bit hard, a bit difficult. As an Indian, I can say that I don't know a lot of what North Indians eat or talk or the language. Last year, Aware published a book called Growing Up Indian. And several times I have been asked to appear on TV and so on, talk about your culture or talk about the food and so on. I've been asked. And the way asked me to write, and I said, I'm not representative of India. You know, I'm not even representative of Malayali Indian. Because I grew up here. And there is no one culture, one kind of food. There's a multiplicity. India, there is, and it's very difficult for Singaporeans who think in one way, because we are PAP trained, you know, and to understand that. So we will have difficulty. It is difficult. Eventually, Aware did persuade me to write, and the book on Malayali Indians didn't include me. When I saw the writer, and I said, "Why didn't you include me?" Who can deny my existence, you know? but the thing is, my name, Constance Singam, doesn't tell you I'm a Malayali. You know? So anyway, Aware persuaded me to write a chapter because my culture is different from the other cultures. There is Hindu culture, there is Muslim culture, there is, in Kerala anyway, the Syrian Christian culture, and we all have different kinds of food. So I cannot represent all of them. I can only represent myself. And the essay I wrote was about growing up a Catholic. You know, the culture of the Catholic. We celebrated only New Year's Day, Christmas, Easter, Good Friday. Well, Good Friday we marked. And I knew nothing about Onam, for instance. You know, till recently people are picking up Malayalis, even Catholic Malayalis are picking up. And one day all the Malayalis in Singapore will celebrate Onam, without knowing that Onam was a harvest festival, which we as Catholics, 500 years ago, when we became Catholics, whoever was in charge of us said, you know, dismiss these celebrations as pagan. You know, so culture has changed over the years, and we will be celebrating Onam, you know, and it is impossible for all of us to understand what India is, you know, and I wouldn't want to be in India now for what's happening in India. So, yes, they think everybody eats chili. I don't. My cooking it's not very spicy. Malayali cooking is not very spicy. They think we eat biryani. I had not eaten biryani till my adulthood, and maybe, you know, because it's not my cuisine. So you just have to tell them, look, I have never eaten. I know they protest. And because of my name, people will come and ask me, why aren't you speaking Tamil? Because I'm not Tamil. You know, but there is that insistence, the stubbornness, the ignorance. It's ignorance. Put it down to ignorance. You know, and yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so to address your point about the biryani, right? I think it's great that you spoke up to him and tried to educate him. Unfortunately, I don't think it was an ideal response that you got, but often they're only stubborn uncle kind of taxi drivers where I find there's no arguing with them. And you, in Malay we say buang current, you just waste electricity trying to like argue with them. But I really think the ideal response could be, obviously you're from that culture, you would be the authority in that, right? So I hope that, you know, if we are ever kind of called out, whatever, for ignorance, the right response would be to be humble about it and expect to be schooled by someone else who is from that culture. That said, though, I think I kind of also maybe don't blame him for assuming these things because of the fact that it's kind of widely available in hawker centers, even stuff like rendang, for example, right? It's also Malay community festivals kind of food. You eat it every day, you're gonna be morbidly obese. But then, people assume those things. So I don't blame him for his assumption, but I do blame him for that whole, no lah, I know better, because I don't know why he knows better, but he's a stubborn uncle, that's all. Any other questions? Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. My name is Madhu, and I just wanted to talk about, the topic is loving Singapore, right? So when I was hearing both of you talk, I was just thinking to myself, what is Singapore, right? How do you define that national identity? And both of you have rightly pointed out in some instances that it was constructed specifically because we became an independent country. There was a need to pull out certain elements of society to create an identity so we could distinguish ourselves from our neighbours in some ways, especially since Singapore wanted to distinguish itself from the rest of the Nusantara, Malaya, so on and so forth. When I was in university, I did a dissertation, and it was investigating why local Singaporean Indians don't get along with migrant or foreign Indians. So I was doing the interviews, there was so much emotions from the Singaporeans, they don't talk like us, they don't speak like us, they don't get it, they don't appreciate us. Then when I tried to find out what exactly, it couldn't really answer me, because so much of what national identity is, right, is these reconstructed markers, serving NS, eating Singaporean food, so on and so forth, we could break down. So I guess I want to ask you, right, what you make of our national identity. Do you think it is fluid? Is it constructed? Does it have to always be Chinese, Malay, Indian? Should we recognize now that Burmese, Filipinos, Banglas now also form what is now being Singaporean and that sort of thing? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Constance, you want to do? You're near the mic.
It is constructed, and we are still a nation in the making. And one of the things that has happened, of course, is that we had different phases of immigration, and so over the years, over 200 odd years, different phases of immigration. And in the 70s, for instance, it was more settled, and then we got new immigrants. So every now and then we get this, and they're not small groups of people, they are very large groups of people of particular race or particular nationality coming in. It upsets the equilibrium of what it is to be Singaporean. So I don't know when we will see that, because population policies seem to then upset this equilibrium. And I remember writing an article, why do I feel like a foreigner in my own country? In one of the papers, in one of my columns. And that was what I was feeling, In my old age, I have decided my community is my country. My community of society activists, my friends, people who I am surrounded by, they are my community. And in that community, we have no racism, ageism, classism, all that we suspend because we focus on value system. So that's how I have found my own comfort in my old age. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. In one of my plays, I heard this line where one character asks another, how do you define being Singaporean? And the person answers, a Singaporean is someone who spends too much time
trying to define what a Singaporean is. So I got in a loop, right? So I think it's a great question, but I also want to ask, like, why do we need a national identity, right? Beyond certain things like, say, let's say defense, for example, right? But even then also, one knows that within a military hierarchy, often it's like do or die, whether or not you love a country, whatever, is sometimes quite secondary to the fact that you belong to a certain kind of like command structure. And that's why, some people make, difficult moral decisions during war, right? But because, you're following instructions. So this question of national identity, I feel sometimes, so for people who are very nationalistic, for people who are very invested in the idea that, Singapore is the best, Singapore is perfect, I'm so proud to be Singaporean, I sometimes feel that that's kind of like a lazy thing to do because you don't develop personality. You know what I mean? You don't take time to cultivate yourself and your own interests. You just go like, oh, I'm Singaporean, and then you expect people to like, oh yeah, Singapore, your exchange rate very good, you live in a clean and green country, wow, you have that kind of like, you're basking in the reflected glow of how good Singapore is. So I have some questions about why we need national identity, and I'm kind of concerned also in the brandishing of a national identity to kind of divide and other people, right? Because I think what's more important is actually overcoming these kinds of divisions and just recognizing that kind of like common humanity, right? So this idea between the local born Singaporeans, the foreign born, I just wonder whether this harnessing or mobilizing of national identity is a way to express already existent kind of prejudices against certain groups of people. Is a way to exclude. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, we can have one last question. Okay, we're going to give Sarah.
Oh.
Hi, Alfian. Hi, Constance. I'm Sarah. Thank you so much, Constance, for paving the way, for your courage, and really, because it is a cycle, you gave me the courage, and hopefully I'll give my daughter the courage to do the same. I think just your book has really I found hope, comfort, and courage through your book. And I think my question is, through your experiences that have left you feeling, psychologically unsafe and even less belong, how do you reclaim that sense of psychological safety and belonging over the years?
All right. That's the purpose of my book. It's a search for my place in Singapore, and how do I get into trouble like I did during the Aware saga. How did I get there, I think at the end of the day, as I said earlier, you form your own community because you have to ignore what's happening around you. And we can already see racism surfacing because of what's happening in the cabinet, and but you have your own community of people. You have to nurture that community around you so you can ignore the negativity, and so that's how I have found my peace, is that I have Aware, for instance, where we share values. I have civil society activists, civil society groups. I always tell people, join a group and you will have a sense of belonging. I think it was years ago, I think it's in my book. I remember Corina, who is now the executive director of Aware, and she made that public recently. Years ago, she was going to leave Singapore because she was frustrated. 1980s, 1990s were frustrating times in Singapore because of the national language policy, particularly. And she was about to leave Singapore. Then she became very active in Aware. And she decided, okay, this is the place for me. So you don't think about the whole of the Singapore. You think about your place in your own community, in what you do. And that's the only way. Because Singapore is so small, everybody is in your face. So it's difficult to form that kind of idea. And that's the way to go. So you raise your children among that community, and give them, empower them, give them hope.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking me the question. Thank you.
Maybe just to close, to go back to this theme of ways to love Singapore, I think it's very important that as much as we might discuss some ways, it's so important not to be prescriptive about it, right? And I think the way to love Singapore is to avoid having people tell you there's one way it should be, right? Or there's only one way. It's something absolute that you have to figure out for yourself. And in fact, I realized that I would certainly love a country much more if it gave me that freedom to love it the way I choose. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alfian and Constance. You've given us a lot of things to think about. And actually there were a lot of lines that were dropped between the both of them that will be featured in our upcoming documentary. So we're releasing that early next week, so you can look out for it. With that, we'd like to end the session. So Constance and Alfian, please stay where you are. So we will be, for those of you who would like to get any of their books, you can purchase them here. And for those of you, I see Sarah's daughter already has Where I Was. And if you would like a signature from Constance, you can, we'll lay a table in front so you can queue up from the other side. And last shout out. So we are partnering, we have a partner who's with us till today on Lawat SG. So they are a wonderful collective who are trying to reclaim the narratives of former Southern Islanders as well as their descendants and doing extremely important work. So please talk to them, find out more about what they're cooking up for 30th of July, because it's a huge day for them, and it's called Panggilan Anak Pulau. So with that, I'd like to end the session, and can we please give a round of applause to Alfian and Constance again.